in this particular report, in fact, it starts off with a couple of X-rays showing a detail of the picture, and then immediately after that is a similar X-ray taken from the sketch in Milan. Now, of course, looking at these X-rays, you've got to bear in mind that one is of our enormous canvas, or a detail of our enormous canvas. The other is a detail of a tiny little canvas, so big. Certainly, the inference drawn by Dr. Eastlaw, who prepared this report, was that the general facture of the two works was extraordinarily similar. All the X-ray showed, I think, essentially new, was the underdrawing, which again was of a very generalized kind, a broad, sweeping, very generalized kind of underdrawing, as you might say, very much the underdrawing of an artist who was, as you might say, thinking with a piece of chalk in his hand, rather than someone who was putting in the outline of a thing that had already been established and which he was going to follow with a fair degree of care and meticulousness. This report, as I say, which is extremely long and has enormous appendices of results and analyses and so on, but does in fact come to the final conclusion, and perhaps I should just read it because it's not very long. Nicholas Eastlaw says, then, in conclusion, a number of features of the materials and technique of the painting correlate well with studies of accepted paintings by Tiepolo. In particular, we may cite the similarity of features within the radiograph of virtue, nobility, ignorance, and fame with those apparent in the radiograph of the modello for the painting in the Museo Pol di Pezzoli, the correspondence of the ground color, composition, and structure with those in painting by Tiepolo, and the overall palette of pigments used, which closely relates to that known to have been used by Tiepolo. I'd like to introduce you to Virtue, Nobility, Ignorance, and Fame by Giambattista Tiepolo. Perhaps first you should meet these figures in more detail. The lady on the left-hand side, a winged figure carrying a spear and dressed in this marvelous red, orange, and yellow skirt, is Virtue. Sometimes she would have a star on her bosom, but this time it seems to be missing. And then over here on her left, wearing a pale blue skirt with damask decorations, is Nobility, and she can be recognized because in her left hand she carries a small statuette of Minerva. Now, these are allegorical figures, standardized figures that one would find in many Italian paintings of the 17th and 18th century. And in this instance, of course, they represent the typical virtues of a great Italian family. Virtue is obviously a very desirable thing for the family to have, and nobility, of course, is an absolute prerequisite. As a result of having these valuable qualities, Fame, whom you see flying in the sky above, blowing a trumpet, is one of the essential consequences of all this, of these admirable characteristics. And then down below, the other aspect of them is that they put to flight ignorance, who is dropping out of the canvas at the bottom. Ignorance recognized by her bat, which you can see here, I think, and also by this plant over here, her poppy. It's a ceiling painting. You've got to imagine it really floating a little bit like this, but 20 feet above your head. in the middle of the ceiling of a great room of the Caiselli Palace at Udine. Not a thing, of course, that one would gaze at the whole time, but something that was simply intended to act as the culminating point, if you like, of a very grand apartment. You actually notice, if you look at it carefully, that it's not quite symmetrical around the central axis. The line here across these two horizontal edges tilts up a bit towards the left, and at the top the same line also again tilts up a little bit towards the left. Now this is quite important because it shows that this picture was painted for this particular location, because the room itself was not quite symmetrical. It had two long side walls which were parallel to each other, but the outer walls of the building with the windows at either end of the room were not quite perpendicular to the side walls. And this irregularity in shape had resulted in these adjustments here so that the unusual shape of the room might not be too obvious to the casual observer. When I saw this picture for the first time, the thing I think that struck me most was that it was a very, very unusual picture. It hasn't got the precise finish, if you like, of a typical Tiepolo ceiling. It's painted with the most extraordinary rapidity, with the most extraordinary kind of energy. He's painting, as the Italians say, alla prima. He's painting very much directly onto the canvas. Much of the paint surface is quite thin, the paint surface of the sky, for example. But wherever you get whites, they're quite heavily loaded on. And so, for example, here you can see this white patch of cloud here, or these clouds over on this side. Again, the paint is loaded on in much thicker fashion to the rest of the painting. And in all the details, for example, let us say, for example, in the little statuette of Minerva, the painting is extraordinarily rapid, extraordinarily free. And down here in the sleeve of Ignorance, the brush loads in the paint very quickly, very thickly, very rapidly, and without any hesitation at all. We have now looked at all the evidence that we've been able to gather about this remarkable picture. We've looked at the scientific evidence, very carefully done and apparently entirely conclusive. We've looked at the extraordinary historical background of this picture, and we've also looked at the picture itself. And all these things point only in one direction, that we have a picture of the 18th century, that we have a picture of the Tiepolo studio, and when we consider the brilliant quality of the paint surface over much of the area of this painting, we are led to the inevitable conclusion that this is a picture by Giambattista Tiepolo himself.